I'm DJ Madsen. Welcome back to my channel. I have Kurt Havens here today, and we're going to pick apart another study.
How's it going?
You got the study pulled up? We'll kind of
Yeah.
dive right in.
Yeah, so it was done by Dr. Bazin. So what's kind of cool about this guy is he had such an impact on the world of endocrinology that they actually name the current time frame that we're in now as the post-Bazin era. So, and they name anything before this exact study as the pre-Bazin era. So this was done in 1996, and believe it or not, before this study came out, actually 2001, I'm sorry for this study. Before this came out, most medical doctors didn't understand that testosterone grew muscle. It was like an unknown thing. They debated, was it just anti-catabolic or did it do something else? They really had no idea, and there were no studies looking at it, right? So there were lots of studies done on hormones until the late 70s and early 80s, and then the FDA basically outlawed the majority of them or forced companies to stop producing them, and they basically research stopped, and then it started up again. It's like people like me are only around because of this guy Bazin. There would be no one would even be looking at these things if it weren't for this guy. So this particular study is a dose response relationship in healthy men of graded testosterone. So he took 61 guys and basically gave them all different doses of testosterone and wanted to see what would happen. And that's kind of what you and I wanted to look at and how this
And this
applies to
is
bodybuilders.
This is one of the hallmark studies that we see referenced in our industry and even outside of our industry. I think this is where the 600 milligram dosage guidelines in terms of safety and effectivity comes from. This is referenced more than any other study, I think, that I've ever heard of. This is the first time that I've actually looked into it. I've always heard it referenced, but we actually look a little bit closer now. For this group, they took healthy men, 18 to 35 that were not hypogonadal, and they administered weekly injections of 25, 50, 125, 300, and 600 milligrams for the course of 20 weeks.
Yep. And they used a GnRH agonist as well. And you and I talked about this previously. This is so, unless someone has used steroids for a long time, when you first start using steroids, or you first start TRT, there's still some background level of testosterone that's produced by the body. So if they didn't block total natural production at the same time, you would have huge variations in what people would get, right? So you'd get someone, and you and I see this in our clients, you get some guys that take 100 milligrams and their T's off the chart, and you get other guys that take 100 and can't even function. Mm-hmm. So they did this to like literally level the playing field. So these guys are equal. They were also all people that had exercise. They were otherwise healthy, and they had previous exercise experience outside of competitions in the last year. So they weren't like competitive athletes, but they were all regular gym guys, I guess, 18 to 35.
Yeah, they all had that background, and they continued that administration throughout the study in conjunction. They did once monthly injections. And I don't think they spoke specifically on what they utilized, but they continued that throughout the duration of the study. They all had those weightlifting backgrounds. And in this study in particular, I think one of the important things to look at is that obviously there's going to be some degree of variation because we're using a population that's not bodybuilders, but there were specific dietary guidelines implemented with the study. There was standardized protein intake and caloric intake, and it was monitored through 24-hour food recalls. They had a specific, I think, nutrition software that they utilized. So that's something that's missing from a lot of these other studies, that they're looking into the use of anabolics and the effects on maybe fat mass or muscle mass. They did have dietary guidelines with this study, and they were also instructed not to engage in any strength training. So we are looking solely at the effects of the exogenous testosterone without implementing strength training or particularly high protein intake diets.
Yep. And the long and short of it, we can dive into the actual numbers, but basically it shows that the 50 milligram and the 125 really yielded nothing. The 50 basically reversed anything positive. So it's below a natural level. So any of these guys, at least for a guy under 35, so any of these guys who were in that unfortunate group basically lost muscle.
And the only sexual dysfunction that was reported was in the 50 milligram group as well, right?
Yep. Um, and I was looking for so compliance wise, it was pretty much 100% compliance. And 100% took the GnRH agonist, and 99% of the injections of testosterone were administered. It was a single injection of Test-D, just for reference, a weekly, which is fine. It's not ideal, but for this study, it's fine. And I've spoke about it before in other videos. Generally, testosterone and anthate is used in studies and not cypionate. It's got a much more predictable like pharmacokinetics than cypionate. No one really knows all the details on cypionate, even though it's the most prescribed version of testosterone in the US. It was invented out of a patent need because an anthate was already a patented drug at the same time. So in other countries, so they couldn't use it here. So they invented cypionate. And it has, similar to other esters with that extra serine group like MPP and parabolin, it has a very unpredictable half-life. No one actually knows. That's why you see, when you try to look up the half-life of MPP, you'll get these broad ranges, right? Some things say 3 days and some say 7 days, and same with parabolin. Like, no one knows, and that's actually accurate. No one really knows. And same with cypionate. We estimate based on the carbon number. So in theory, it should be about 8 days, but no one really knows. So an anthate.
Do you use cypionate or do you use an anthate?
An anthate. And also during production, something interesting, most people would never see this, but during production, cypionate's very fragile. If it boils, it's junk, gels. So the temperature has to be very controlled when it's made. And if it smokes at all, the whole batch is junk. An anthate then can tolerate larger fluctuations.
I did not know that.
So it's easier to make an anthate than it is cypionate. Now, for a pharmaceutical company, it's not a big deal because they just set the temperature and that's the max it's going to go to. But for people that are making their own, cypionate tends to be a little more difficult. Or at least you have to pay attention to it. Yeah, I always use an anthate, not a particular reason. It was just what I used the first time, and I've always just kind of stuck with it. I've tried cypionate. I noticed no difference. I just tend to stick with things that I know work. You want to look at I was looking for the
main things that they monitor. Let me put notes on here. So obviously they were monitoring not only muscle tissue, but they were also monitoring strength. And I thought that was an interesting aspect of the study as well, especially because they were being instructed not to engage in strength training outside. They looked at fat-free mass and fat mass. They did inquire on sexual function, but this was done based on just logs and questionnaires. They checked plasma lipids. They did do inquiries into mood and cognitive function periodically, hemoglobin levels, and I think they were checking PSA regularly. And then there were some charts with the IGF-1 and liver enzymes and some of the other blood chemistry factors as well.
I think the two of the cooler ones to look at are the total testosterone and the free testosterone. So on the 25 milligram a week and the 50 milligram a week, the total testosterone. So it gives you where these people averaged, with the average person in that group. They were 12 people, I think, in each group, give or take. So the average in the 25 milligram was 593 nanograms per deciliter testosterone before the study. During the study at week 16, there was a 20-week study, right, with a 16-week washout, I believe. At week 16, they tested these hormones. So they were fully at peak. Everything should have been moving along. These guys had their total testosterone was 340 from 593. So it basically made them hypogonadal. So they lost 85 points. In the 50 milligram group, they lost 64 points. And for some reason, the average was actually lower here. The average person in the 50 milligram group was at 269 grams per deciliter total testosterone week 16. At 125, it started to at least break even. The total testosterone went from 553 to 57, plus or minus 75. So there was some variation in that one. But you're not going to feel great with a total testosterone of 75 as a man. Then the 300, so really the two groups that are the most fascinating, that this is where both bodybuilding doses come from and also TRT doses. So at 300 milligrams, the total went from 653 to 691. So like not a huge increase. They gained, this is 143, which is not correct. They gained, 40 points, give or take. But they did gain more muscle. We can look at the muscle gain in a second. And the 600 the 600 milligram group went
Milligram.
from 632 average to 1737. So it's kind of cool to see, right? And this is kind of where you see the background testosterone working. So in a normal guy, for my clients or your clients, if you gave them 600 milligrams of testosterone, you tested, most likely their total test is going to be higher than 1700. It would normally be 22 or 2300, maybe 24. That's because there's still some endogenous production that you're picking up here versus a pure 1700 just from the testosterone that was given. So the numbers are going to be a little lower than you would see in real life.
And we had also looked in what they had tested. They did not pull E2, right? We didn't find the E2.
I didn't see E2, which would have been kind of cool, right? Because they didn't use an AI. These
So
guys
without
would.
monitoring estrogen as well, once those dosages go beyond that,
Yeah.
we had 125, 300, 600. Once we hit 300, it's very likely that we have some issues with estrogen and
Yeah.
aromatization occurring at that
Depending on the
specific
person.
dosage. So
Yeah.
we'd see that 600 even without, actual production occurring. We'd probably see that number get higher just with estrogen management alone.
Totally. It's very, I mean, I'm going to speculate. It's possible that Bazin didn't fully understand aromatization back then. I mean, if you think that was
What year was this?
2001.
Okay.
So it was, so what is that, 22 years ago? It's possible. It's
I
possible
feel
that
I feel old.
it's possible in the medical community that it wasn't known. I mean, I was out of college, but I was young. I don't honestly know. I didn't know. I don't think I knew what aromatization was in 2001.
I think I was in middle school.
So so it's very possible, or he didn't find it as a valuable thing, or didn't want to look at it. The free testosterone is pretty scary. So in the 25 milligram, it was actually negative. It was a negative 3.2 average free, a negative 3 for the 50 milligram group, and then it went from, it was basically like a 3.5 to. Am I reading the wrong thing? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at LH. Sorry.
I'm
The
on
free
fat
was
free
negative
mass right
33,
now.
negative 25 in the two lower groups, a 67 in the 300 milligram group, and 211 free testosterone in 600.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, I mean, clearly a big difference, right? Even a big difference between 300 milligrams and 600 milligrams. That being said, 600 milligrams is not a beginner dose of testosterone, right? I have lots of guys that are on TRT or on first cycle or very new to this game. 600 is not a dose that I would ever recommend for someone as their first time. It's not needed. If it's needed, something else is wrong, right? Food is wrong. Some other lifestyle thing is wrong, or perhaps they don't have the genetic propensity to be using testosterone. I don't think that
Now
that's
we
beginner
see a
dose.
lot of people starting out as a standard cycle, introductory cycle. We see a lot of people jumping straight to 500. Do you think any of that comes from this data specifically?
Probably, and I just think bodybuilding lore, right? It was like the standard. It was like the standard first cycle was something like 500 milligrams a test, and then it's spread to be 500 milligrams a test with some sort of ridiculous kickstart of D-ball first, as if that was really going to get things moving in the right direction. It blow your estrogen out immediately. Yeah, I mean, this probably didn't help that. Where that came from, that might have been a thing from before this. That would be before my time looking at this stuff. It's not something that was needed, like we talked about before. It's 300 milligrams, and I gained almost 20 pounds. So if this is going to work out well for you, you're going to respond to a lot lower than 600 milligrams. And again, the results that we're going to see here in this study aren't necessarily reflective of what you would see in the real world. These guys weren't exercising, and their food was controlled, but it wasn't an ideal diet. They were not fed any sort of super high protein diet. They were just fed a regular diet. They were just controlled for calories.
And it was just calories too. The outside of protein, carbohydrates were not dictated, dietary fats, sources were not dictated. And again, there's always going to be variation because what is it that Todd always said? If you lock someone up and you only feed them, that's the only way to guarantee compliance. These were not men that were locked up in jail cells being given specific foods. So there's still going to be some variation there.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, just so people understand that it's not, I wouldn't consider that a beginner dose, and I don't think there's any need for any of that stuff in the beginning. What else you want? We can look at muscle mass. So this is going to be kind of the same thing. Thigh and quadricep muscle volume.
I got
We
to
want to look
catch
at
up to your
weight.
table.
Change in muscle performance. Do you want to look at any of those, or do you want to look? There was, as far as I know, there
Thigh
was
and
no
muscle.
change in sexual activity, sexual desire, or spatial cognition, at least in the 125, 300, and 600.
I think the only negative in terms of cognitive function, sexual performance, there was an erection issue reported with the 50 milligram group, and that's the only one that was reported in.
Yeah, again, not surprising, right? I mean, that's, you would think, because it's putting you in a worse place than you were naturally.
And it's important too to notice that even though obviously we're looking at the dose dependent muscle mass from this study, and that's what's often referenced, the 600 milligrams is frequently referred to as the safe, and I don't know where that really comes from, safe dosage of testosterone, especially when someone's starting out, they might not have a lot of background use or information, and they say, well, I can definitely use up to 600 milligrams. That's where this is stemming from. But once we
Yep.
start seeing issues in blood work, it is also dose dependent, and that's what this
Yep.
study reveals. But that's the part that's often ignored and overlooked.
Yep. But yeah, but so they do consider, based on this study and all those, the ones that came after this one, basically 600 was the top dose. It's really as far as I'm aware, it's the top dose of testosterone that's ever really been studied, at least in any peer review study that I've seen. So 600 they, like you said, it's considered medically safe, but that doesn't mean across the board it's going to be a safe dose for everyone. It should, in reason, be it should be relatively safe, but that doesn't mean it always is the case, right? I
And
know
I
lots
like
of
that
guys
they
get
had
powered.
they had incorporated muscle performance in this as well, not just actual measurements and use of DEXA scans. But again, when we start looking at completely suppressing their natural production, introducing it to 25 up to 125 milligram groups, those were the ones that did not report any significant or notable changes within their strength when they were doing muscle performance testing. And
Correct.
then 300 on up all had notable changes.
Yep.
Pulling
So
that.
I'm looking for body composition analysis. So this is where it kind of gets interesting, at least for me or for the people that are watching this, right? Because most people that are taking testosterone are probably doing it more for muscle size, I would think,
Mm-hmm.
than anything else. So again, the 25 milligram per week dose lost muscle, which is not surprising. If you make someone hypogonadal, they're most likely going to lose muscle. The 50 milligram group gained 0.6 pounds. So to me, I don't know if I consider that statistically significant. It seems like pretty much a wash at 125 milligrams. So depending on the person, 125, 150-ish is probably considered a true TRT. If you broke it down, ester subtract,
Yeah.
per week to literally match a physiological amount of testosterone is probably close to 125. They gain 3.4. This is in kilograms, I believe. Right?
Is it kilograms? Yeah, it
Pound?
is. It's
Kilograms.
3.4.
3.4 kilograms. Now, the reason why I brought up that was TRT, but yet they gained weight, because I think people have a misconception. TRT, generally, unless you're severely depleted, you most likely won't gain any muscle on TRT, at least short term. I believe it's because they removed all natural testosterone from them, so the 125 dose was slightly lower, and because they removed exercise. I just think actually, I'm not really sure why that occurred like that. I would say normally at 125, the only advantage you would see on TRT versus natural testosterone production, assuming that the milligrams are equal, would be the fact that you don't get any dips, right? Like
I
on
think
TRT,
part of that can be probably diet derived as well. If we're taking groups that, again, they're not bodybuilders, let's look at the average person's protein intake. Most humans are actually eating what, 3 meals a day? That's obviously not what we're doing. But when you give someone a set protein goal and you force them to hit that goal,
you're going to gain weight.
even if this is at completely replacement levels, obviously 50 and 25 milligrams is going to have a negative impact. But at 125 with controlled protein intake, I could see that being beneficial from diet alone,
Yeah, that
hitting
could be.
those goals daily.
Yeah, because it's contradictory to what I was going to say. But I guess, yeah, like you said, if you force someone to eat more, they're most likely going to grow more. because normally you wouldn't see that at TRT level. Over time, someone might build some more muscle depending on their age and their training status, but you generally don't see that. And I think my point in saying that is I think a lot of people misuse the word TRT, and I think a lot of guys go on TRT when they don't really need to be on TRT, like younger
Yes.
guys in their 20s. Not sure what you're doing there unless you actually have a health problem. So that's kind of my point, is that it shouldn't be used to gain muscle. It's supposed to literally just fix a health problem at that point. So 300 milligrams. So, and the other reason why I brought the dosing up before with TRT is the FDA has set the standard guideline for TRT. It's generally 250 milligrams or under. And that's based on one of the studies that followed this, where they basically show, they look further into this, and they basically show that anything under 300 milligrams is not really causing any anabolism. That's kind of the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there are outliers and there are people that might grow a little bit on less than that, but that's pretty much the standard for most guys. Are not going to really put on much mass underneath 300 milligrams. And that's, you can kind of see that here, that it starts to go up there. And then it goes, it's dose dependent, but it doesn't go, it's not linear, right? You have to double the dose in order to get what the difference is. What were the numbers?
And then our 300 milligram group was 5.2.
Yep.
And 600 milligram was 7.9.
Yeah, so you double the dose to get a 65% increase. No, a 35% increase,
Math.
right? So
I have no idea. I'm just going to say yes because I cannot do math on the fly.
I could be wrong. That's off the top of my head. That's what it looks like. So, but my point is, it's not a linear thing. You don't double the dose and you get twice the amount of muscle,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes in a line like that. And we typically see, not in studies, but in the bodybuilding community, in the coaching community, it seems to stagger like that until about a gram, and then it starts to really steady out. And you will continue to grow if you bring it above that point, assuming you're experienced and you need that much. But it is definitely not a linear thing. There is a difference between a 1 gram and 2 grams of testosterone, but it's not going to be a large percentage like that.
And then the fat mass, also that was interesting with specifically the 25 and 50 milligram groups in comparison to the 125 through 600.
Yep. Yeah, they actually gain fat in the 25 milligram group, which again is going to be expected if you're hypogonadal, right?
Yes.
These are all symptoms of having low testosterone as a man, is you're going to have higher body fat and you're going to have less muscle mass.
I think that's a question that I get a lot too. Like, hey, I'm truly hypogonadal. Will TRT help me with body composition?
Sure.
Here's your answer.
and you find, honestly, body fat loss almost seems more dramatic in hypergonadal overweight men. They almost experience more fat loss than you see, an average guy like myself, or your husband going on TRT is not necessarily going to lose a ton of fat, but you see almost a more dramatic, a robust loss of fat in guys that are overweight can lose a significant amount of fat on a low dose of testosterone. Whereas like I wouldn't respond fat loss wise probably until a larger dose.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we're not using medically, if there's a problem and you're gaining fat because you're hypogonadal is one thing, but none of us are supposed to be using androgens to lose fat. That's not the ideal use of androgens. They're not diet drugs. And then you see, so obviously, and then the fat loss continues basically up to 125. It was basically an even break. And then at 300 and 600, the fat loss is almost linear there at 0.5, half a pound of fat loss versus, more than a pound of fat loss at 600. DEXA.
And I have a question for you, and you might actually know this. This is when you, if you are a participant in one of these studies, do you get to choose which group you're in?
No.
So some poor guys got stuck in that 25 milligram group.
Yeah, there are open studies where you're aware of the drug. A lot of times they'll do them I've seen them with growth hormone sometimes when they do with people with AIDS. They do an open study because the people are all really ill and they're just looking for data to show that the drug is doing something. They're not really looking for the downside of not getting the drug. As you used to see a long time ago, there were some original Anadrol 50 studies done in AIDS when AIDS was first a thing, and the control group got nothing, and then they passed away. So that's not really ethical. So we don't really do that anymore. So now the worst case is you get at least another effective drug. You would never get a full-on placebo. And in this group, the same kind of thing. I mean, they're not getting junk, they're just getting an adequate amount of testosterone. No, they were randomly selected. They were 61 guys. They were divided into even
It's
groups,
rough.
as close as they get to even, and they were just assigned. It stinks to be in that group. I wonder what they used. Unless they clearly couldn't see the injection, it would be curious to see how they administered the shot, because anyone who's ever had a shot of any of those amounts, you would kind of know the difference between someone gave you a quarter of a cc versus 2 cc's.
Well, I will say for this particular study too, these were supposedly people that had never
Never
competed,
done it.
never used,
Totally.
any type of
Yeah, it would
testosterone
just be. I
or
would be curious to
performance
see. Clearly,
enhancements.
they're not looking at the injection, because you could probably guess
Until
what
I
group they're
started
in.
regular injections, I don't think I would have known the difference. I was one
Okay.
of those that went to the doctors and closed my eyes. So
Oh, good point. Okay. Yeah, they probably didn't allow the people to see what they were doing. Or they also might have filled it with something inert, like more carrier oil
Mhm.
or something, just to
So
fill
it's
up the.
even across the board.
Yeah. Very interesting, though. So, where do we kind of stand with this? Because I feel like the point we're trying to get across here is almost the opposite of the study, right? We're trying to say, at least my opinion is, we're trying to say to people, doing steroids and sitting on the couch is not going to yield anything productive. But yet the study shows that it did. Right? These guys gained a pretty significant amount of weight. What was the milligrams of the top group? 7.9?
7.9 kilograms. How many pounds is
17
that?
pounds. 17.38. It's a lot of weight. Now, that's clearly not all muscle. Right? There was definitely some muscle tissue that was gained in there. Glycogen. There's some water retention, right? Because we didn't look at estrogen, so who knows how
Hmm.
much fluid they were retaining from the estrogen. There was probably a significant amount. It's hard to really draw a conclusion and prove that point, right? Because here the study is contradicting what you and I would say to people. I just think that it's not necessarily pointing out. I don't know. What do you think about this? This is why I keep getting stuck with this stuff.
So, but I mean, by the study alone, yes, it's effective. And like I told you, I think I told you the story about the client that came to me and he had been running high levels of testosterone and other anabolic steroids because he could not get to the gym on a regular basis. That was his reasoning for it. Whereas to us, that's an absolute backwards approach. You only do that when you are in the gym. Again, it's performance enhancement. So I think obviously, of course, it works in a dose dependent manner. We know that it's confirmed, but also we see the increased risk for negative health impacts as the dose increases. But what we also know is I think this would be a good, solid case to say you don't necessarily need to jump into high levels of testosterone out the starting gate, and you don't need to be messing with multiple compounds and creating complex stacks. Obviously, if you can sit on your butt and not strength train and not use a diet that is geared towards bodybuilding or hypertrophy and still gain lean mass, there's absolutely no reason that you need to start out running 4 compounds. Testosterone is effective independently, even without those other markers in place that in a strength training or bodybuilding scenario, you would have those dialed in.
Okay.
So while we're not going to say run 600 milligrams of testosterone for your first exposure, yes, this study shows that testosterone can be effective. That would be
Yep.
what I pull from it.
Okay. Yeah. I guess looking at it, I guess I could say so this is their first cycle in theory, right? So who knows what they actually would have gained if they were training and they were eating properly with actual muscle tissue. We know that all 17 of those 17 pounds were not pure tissue gained. It clearly shows that testosterone is effective, but like you said, that's not the best technique to use, is to just sit around and inject drugs. And I would speculate, if this were repeated with the same group of people and you gave them the same dose again, they probably would gain nothing the second time around.
Mm-hmm.
Right? As we see, even in people that go to the gym, this is why you have to titrate your dose up over time. It doesn't necessarily mean each cycle goes up, but it means over time you need more and more. The farther you get from your natural state, the more drugs, unfortunately, it takes to continue that path. And I think that's one of the reasons that I use to explain to people, don't do polypharmacy. Don't do multiple complicated stacks when you first start drugs, because at some point you're going to have to do that. So if you start doing that, you can't go down. You always have to go up. Or best case scenario, you can stay the same, right? You might be able to run the same cycle more than one time. That's limited. So if you started out of the gate, I had a young guy who started his first cycle before he met me, and he was on 1,000 milligrams of various things out of the gate. He ended up experiencing all sorts of side effects. He had to go to the doctor several times, anxiety, other health problems, heart stuff, estrogen issues. And I kept trying to explain to him, this is why you don't start in this place. You don't need testosterone and equipoise and Primabol and growth hormone and all these things when you're 22 years old out of the gate. It doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because now his next cycle, unfortunately, is going to be more than a gram. And
I
he's already
think
experienced
what I have to explain to people over and over is like you're not going to go backwards. You always have the option to titrate your dosages and exposure. So there's no reason to start that high. But it's also really hard because when we speak about that, obviously for me, I'm a little bit different, but from someone that is an experienced user, from an advanced competitor, it's hard and it's not very palatable to the average person to hear someone that they know is on 2 grams a gear a week telling them, hey, we're going to start you at 250. That's where we're going to start. We're going to see how you respond and slowly increase. That is frustrating, especially because people get impatient. It's the nature of venturing into performance enhancing drugs and manipulating your hormones. There's a degree of impatience. So having someone that's taking 2,000 milligrams a week tell you that you're not going to be taking any more than 300 starting out is frustrating. But now this data is here to show that testosterone alone is effective and in less than ideal circumstances at that.
Yes. And I don't think it might seem rosy in the beginning to want to work your way up in doses like that, but it's not all it's cracked up to be. And you don't want to rush that process where now all of a sudden you're stuck using grams of gear, because that's all you can now use for the rest of your life. So although a lot of pro bodybuilders don't talk about this, when they talk about blasting and cruising, which is what most guys do, guys today generally don't come off. There's really no point. It's not advantageous to come on and off steroids once you're past a certain age. And if this is what you're doing for a career, their cruise level, what is supposed to be some sort of TRT, unfortunately, for most of these guys, is closer to a gram. They just don't talk about this stuff. Maybe, like a Chris Bumstead, claimed it was 500 or 600 milligrams. Who knows? That's what he said. I don't know if that's the truth or not. And even that, if you think about that, that's his cruise dose. So his cruise dose is the highest dose used in the study. What is his actual blasting dose? He's never talked about that before. That's where the results lie. So he can talk about his cruise all he wants. That's not what got him there. And I think that when we rush these things, you're going to end up in that place much sooner than you need to be. I don't think there's any point at 27 years old to be using 5 grams of gear, unless you're on
Even
that.
just from a financial perspective.
Yeah, if you don't need it, right? If you're not on the Olympia stage, yeah, from a financial point of view, are you ready to do this? And outside of just finances, what else goes around it, right? You need a doctor. You need a doctor that you can talk to about these things, that's going to be supportive and help you with labs and anything that might pop up, right? And I think this is where, like, the online medical places fail. They're going to wipe their hands clean of you once you start abusing things and you actually need their help. They have no interest in helping you. You need, obviously, health insurance, right? If you have to go to the doctor, if something goes wrong. And I see this in other countries as well. Like, the medical system in the United States is far from perfect, but in other countries, it's downright atrocious. And you see some of the care that people get when they run into issues with steroids. Doctors, first of all, won't treat you if they know you're on steroids. I know in Australia, there's a huge stigma there. Doctors won't even touch you if they think you've been using steroids. In a lot of the European countries, it's similar.
You don't have a right to your own labs in other countries. If you go and have blood work done and it indicates that you are utilizing steroids, your physician will not release copies of your labs to you. They will keep them from you, and you do not have a right as a patient to see your own lab work. That was shocking to me.
Yep.
So as much as people complain about our healthcare system here, we're thankful for it in many ways.
Yeah. I didn't realize it really until I started working internationally and I saw the stuff that went on, and it's really eye opening. So I think that the key why we're bringing that up is it just makes sense to start low, right? Eventually, if you stay in this game, you will unfortunately end up in a higher dose range, but that doesn't mean you need to do that in your first year.
And testosterone alone can be effective.
Totally.
And it's a really good way to learn about your individual response mechanisms by just introducing testosterone. You can't monitor things effectively and know how you're going to respond and appropriately plan other compound use in the future if you don't understand your body's response to testosterone independently.
Yeah, because it is an endogenous hormone. Your body recognizes it already. In theory, it knows what to do with it versus, especially some of the exotic things, your body does not know what to do with boldenone. It has no idea what to do with primobolan. It, so you get these side effects and you don't know what to do. And that's, as a coach, for you and I, this is difficult as well, right? We have athletes that do other things and then they run into problems and we don't know what is causing that problem. We can guess based on history, based on things we know about these compounds, but sometimes it's just a guess. Cool.
So overall, it's effective, but don't sit on your butt.
Yep. Yeah. I think the moral of the story is, clearly testosterone works. It grows muscle. That's not really debatable at this point. It's just not, the study's just there to show that it works. And they removed all the other variables. So you couldn't say exercise did that or food did this but again, not necessarily the way I would apply it in real life by taking it to do absolutely nothing. The outcome would probably be different in reality.
Anything specific you want to add?
No, I think we can do other compounds. I think with this kind of stuff, I think some of them get downright scary when you actually look at what they were used for medically versus what bodybuilders use.
I think next week we want to go into GLP-1s and the polypharmacy of GLP-1s with anabolic steroids together, since we're seeing more and more of that being prescribed now.
Yeah, that's definitely a cool one. Yeah, there's endless content. As long as people keep abusing drugs, we got endless stuff to talk about.
Send us studies. If there's anything that has been sent to you as a reference point, send it our way. We'd love to talk about it. We'll keep these pretty short and sweet so we can do a weekly series on this.
Cool, definitely.
Okay, thank you very much for joining me. Where can they find you?
I'm on YouTube at Kurt.Havens or Atomic Life, and Instagram at Kurt.Havens, and TikTok the same, but I'm very rarely on TikTok.
And I'll post his links down below. All right, thank you for joining me.
Take care.
All right.